Hello and welcome to episode 21 of Dissect Discussions. I'm your host, AB Basson. In this week's episode, I'm joined by Grant James Smidt. If the tactical side of the game is your cup of tea, well, fasten your seatbelt and get ready for an informative podcast. Grant is a well-known technical and performance analyst that has worked extensively in South African football over the last decade and is currently studying towards his UEFA A coaching license. Grant, thanks for joining me on Dissect Discussions. I've tried to have you on the podcast for a few months, I'd say. So it's great to have you on. For those that don't know you and the work you do, what are you involved with these days? I know you're doing your UEFA A license, if I'm not mistaken. Apart from that, what do you do? Obviously, some coaching, some tactical and analytical work. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. I've been listening to your pod and really enjoying it. But I think mostly I've been recommending people I want to hear your interview than actually appearing. So yeah, it's good to be on it. So I'm doing my UEFA A license. Obviously, it's slightly different with COVID. You can't actually travel overseas to do these courses, but thankfully, at least the FA that I'm doing it with, the Scottish FA, they've sort of been really accommodating. So yeah, I'm still managing to do it. We're doing most of it sort of online. The lectures are being done on Zoom instead of in person as they would be in Edinburgh, and then some of the practicals as well on the field. They've also made a good plan in terms of I'm going to be recording some of my own coaching sessions, and then we'll have peer review with some of the other candidates assessing my sessions, me assessing theirs, with a tutor overseeing everything. So they're doing everything they can to, instead of having 50 coaches together and everyone playing in each other's sessions, actually using your own team and still finding a way to keep moving forward. Because we really have no idea when we'll be able to travel, especially South Africans, and there are a fair few South Africans who've taken this route through Scotland. So yeah, I'm busy with your FA license. So that's obviously a big thing just to get that qualification. Of course, naturally, like I've done my local courses as well. Like I did my CAF B license a few years back, but I sort of stopped pursuing that route a bit because they sort of stopped running courses as often, and I've struggled to get onto the CAF A license. As far as I know, it's been a few years since they've run one. So yeah, I went sort of the European route to try and get that qualification. And yeah, my background, I've been working in football in some capacity since I finished school. Obviously, like everyone who starts off in football, I've had jobs in all sorts of other industries as well, at the same time, whether it's working in sales or I went to the States for a bit to do like a country club sort of experience. And I've had various jobs, but yeah, I'd say I've been full-time in football, like having that being my only job since 2012. And then before that, obviously between finishing school up until then, I was more part-time, earning money from coaching courses and bits of work there and there, but I'd say full-time in football since 2012.
So you started in football at Stats, if I'm not mistaken. How were you involved with Stats? And you obviously progressed over the few years there, and then also started getting involved at Ajax Cape Town. I think you left Ajax by the time I arrived there in, 2017, I think you'd already left. How were you involved at Ajax and at Stats over the years?
Yeah, so when I finished school and I went to ETA and I did sports coaching science certificates, and then it took quite a few years to actually start earning a salary in football that I could live off, or that I could at least make enough money from to not have to work other jobs. So I started Stats in 2012, and I was like a coder, which is essentially the person who clips the games. So it takes about 6 to 8 hours to watch the game, to clip all the events, so the shots, the crosses, the passes, the pitch locations that all these events are happening in. And yeah, so basically from there, I just did that for a few months. And this is the route that a lot of people in South African football have done, working for the company before it was Stats. It was called, Amisco, and then it became Prozone, and then it became Stats. But it was all generally the same company in South Africa, just being merged or bought over by other companies. So we've, obviously, there's guys like Wesley Sogo at Stellenbosch, the assistant coach now. He came through. There's loads of the Sundowns analysts all come through, working for Prozone. There was Rian Jacobs, who was assistant coach to Benni McCarthy at Cape Town City last season. He's also from there. Most of the PSL clubs who have analysts have guys who work for Prozone at some point. So I was there. I was with Stats for for about 6 years. I left there, I think the end of 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And then when I was there, I did various things. I was, first working as a coder, so on the South African League and Serie A. So obviously, taking 6 to 8 hours to watch a game, you kind of really get into the nitty gritty of it. You can see positional changes, tactical changes really well. And then from there, I started doing some analysis work. So I worked for some PSL clubs, always remotely. So I did work for Free State Stars, some work for Ajax, doing opposition analysis. So watching the last few games that the team played, putting together reports with PDFs and video reports that would get sent in, back then sort of over DVD, because not all the clubs had really good internet connections back then. And the coach would then watch that and help sort of formulate his game plan. Also did a lot of media work while I was there. So sort of using the data to provide to media houses, giving some context to it, putting some tactical insight behind it, because obviously, just data by itself can be a bit misleading without the context added in. Why did a team have very little possession, or why does one team, make a lot of tackles and another team doesn't? Whatever it might be, there's always that context that needs to be added into it. And then, so I was at Stats, and then while I was there, I got a part-time job at Ajax Cape Town. So I was a team manager initially. So, I was doing things like filling out the team sheets, being there on match days, all that type of stuff. But it was a great experience because the team I was working with was coached by Mahir Davids. And he was, even though I was a team manager, he was extremely open with his time and his advice, let me have even a bit of insight on match days, which is quite rare for team managers to have. And obviously I tried to attend as many sessions as I could, because his training sessions were great, so I could learn from him. And then after a year doing that, I became an assistant coach working with an actual team. And I think I did that for 3 years. So I was working with under 14s and under 15 age groups, worked with some really good coaches, like Justin Hamburger and Ian Taylor and so forth. Ian Taylor less so, because he was more sort of advising the youth at that stage, but really good coaches. So, I loved it there. I did eventually decide to move on. I was a bit busy with another consulting job I'd taken, and I sort of changed a few things that I didn't really think were necessarily going to work out that well. Basically, without getting into too much there, Ajax has always sort of played age up. So the under 13 team would play the under 14, in the under 14 league, the under 14 would play in the under 15 league, and so forth. Obviously, because you want to have, you want to have a challenge on a Saturday, you want to have tight games, you want to test the players. So the club decided to switch that to play age against age again. I think partly just to sort of, have a clean sweep of winning all the leagues and all the cups. And I didn't really think that made sense, because it was kind of prioritizing results or PR sort of over development.
Yeah.
So anyway, I decided to leave and ended up moving on. And I'd love to go back at some point, obviously, and it's new guys, but it just was probably the right time.
Tell me a bit about capturing stats. We always log on to Flashscore or Soccerway or whatever you like to use. And we see the possession stats, we see the shots on target. For those who don't know, how does it get captured? Obviously, some games you only capture that stats afterwards, and certain stats you only capture afterwards, depending on the magnitude of the game. But how does it get captured? And you mentioned there that when you started at stats, you started in such a capacity.
Yeah. So eventually, essentially, the video gets added into a software program, and it has a section with all the different events sort of on one side of it and the video on the other side. And you have your usual arrow keys to move sort of 100th of a second either direction, because you need to see sometimes you've got the first touch to a challenge, for example. And basically you go through the game slowly, pausing constantly and tagging events as they happen. And if you're doing that live, obviously you have a lot more pressure, because you haven't got time to go back and look all the time. You're doing it quite fast. Yeah. So usually more staff are involved doing it live. Maybe one staff member is doing the event. They're saying a pass or cross or shot. Another staff member might be doing the player ID, which player is actually performing that action. Maybe even another staff member doing the pitch locations. So there's all of that stuff involved. And of course, some of it is, I would say it's not objective. There is a subjective element to some of it. So there are certain times where some events are coded with subjective element to it. So for example, I know with the stat you see in mainstream media, things like errors leading to a goal by a goalkeeper, there might be a guideline of how that's coded, but generally there's going to be some subjective element from the individual person coding the game. But you obviously try to remove that as much as possible and have everything consistent and objective. There's very, very clear guidelines on what exactly a cross is, what a shot is. For example, a cross, some people would be surprised at what isn't a cross or what isn't a dribble. Yeah. For example, a dribble, it's not the same for all companies, but we had a very, 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 very tight definition that you had to actually engage a defender, you had to actually beat them and eliminate them. They couldn't still sort of be in your vicinity, and only then would you get a successful dribble. It's where some companies are a bit more liberal with that. So it's quite complicated, and there is, all the different companies have different definitions for events. So that's why you have one company might have 10 shots in a game for a team and another with 11, because there's maybe a header from a corner that they thought was a shot, one thought was a flick on. So that's where the sort of confusion or subjective.
An interesting one is assists, because you see sometimes on transfer market, they like to inflate the assists, be it by, a keeper parrying the ball and going to a player. Then the guy that took the initial shot will get the assist. How did it work for you at Stats, and how did you guys, especially just for interest's sake, how did you guys tally assists?
Yeah, so for us, a long time ago, it was much different. But before I left Stats, they were bought by Opta. So the two companies merged, and Opta's definition has sort of been the official one in the Premier League, because they held the official Premier League rights. So what Opta decided was an assist was what sort of was the official assist count. So they don't count something like having a shot parried that's scored. That's not called, counted as an assist. Or if a cross comes in and gets a bit of a deflection, it might not be an assist either. As you said, transfer market are a bit more liberal, so they'll give things like winning a penalty.
Yeah.
But people have different opinions, and some people think Opta is the gold standard. That's the one you have to listen to. But if you think about a penalty, around 80% of them are scored. So there's not many chances a player can create for a teammate that's better than, that is an actual better chance in winning a penalty. So if you win a penalty and you give your teammate 80% chance of scoring, you kind of the definition of the word assist is basically help that goal, help. So you've definitely helped that goal be scored. So, I like sort of telling assists in sort of penalties won into it and saying you might have 16 penalties won plus, assists plus penalties won. But the official definitions are quite tight. It has to be a direct pass to the teammate. It can't have a deflection. It's pretty tight.
Just to, before we get back on the stats train, I read on LinkedIn that you were involved with the Socceroos in their successful Asian Cup campaign. That's quite interesting. I only found out that just before this podcast. How were you involved there, and how exactly did it work?
Yeah, so Prozone, which was Stats' previous name, opened an Australian office, and they try to obviously sell the analysis services that Prozone provide to the clubs there and the national team. The national team eventually wanted an analyst, and they didn't really have people in Australia within the company that they could do that. So I got assigned to do it. Obviously, with the head of analysis was overseeing it as well and doing a lot of the communication for that. And basically I had to provide the pre-match analysis reports for the coach and the assistant coach. So that would be looking at whether it's South Korea or Iran or Kuwait, wherever they were playing, looking at their danger men, how they play in build up, how they press, how they, when they lose the ball, do they drop back into a shape? Do they look to sort of counter press? They set plays, danger men from corners, as far as even counter-attacking from their attacking corners, how many men they leave back. It's basically any details that could help the coach formulate his game plan. And it was a great experience. It was quite high stress because of the time difference. So I was working sort of through the night during that tournament, and tournaments are stressful because it's like 3 days between matches.
Yeah.
So the minute one match ends, you start sort of starting with the next one, or you actually probably a few games ahead, but in the knockout rounds, you don't always know who the team's going to be playing. So at one point we were sort of preparing, reports for both teams, because, the quarterfinal that they were playing against, the winners of that quarterfinal could be one of two teams.
Yeah.
So we'd have to prepare both eventualities and have those reports ready for both. That was great. It was a great experience, extremely intense, sort of 3-4 weeks. And then also post-match, they wanted reports on their own performance, whether that's video and data, as to actually decide between, as the coaching staff, which players were performed well, were they going to make changes for the next game, all that sort of thing. So that was a great experience.
You also worked as a football consultant. It doesn't say in your profile for which team, and you don't have to say on the podcast which team it was. But what exactly did that job entail, and how did that work? A football for a Premier League team. Let me just state that.
Yeah. So I don't mention publicly who the team is. That's because of the confidentiality agreement we had. They do allow me to put it on my CV, and they do allow me to have I do have a reference letter from them. But in terms of media, they don't allow that. But having said that, I haven't worked in that role for a year, but I'm still on their payroll. They very kindly kept me on their bonus scheme. So until that actually finishes, then I probably could mention it publicly. So basically what happened is a Premier League club wanted to expand their scouting worldwide. They wanted to have consultants on every continent, and they wanted somebody in South Africa who knew African football and had an analysis background. My Prozone background at that stage, I'd been at Prozone for 2 years, so that helped me a lot to get this role. And I started in 2014 working for this club and provided reports, information, team news, tactical information, everything about players on the African continent. So they would use it for a multitude of things, but one of them was recruitment. And yeah, it was a really amazing experience. I mean, every couple of years I flew over to the UK. We had sort of big meetings with all the staff, would meet the head coach, the owner of the club, the head of recruitment. And the head coach would have a presentation for us, and he'd sort of explain his style of play and what he looks for in different positions. So without mentioning names, the first coach I met, his philosophy was that he really liked very attacking fullbacks. He said his dream goal would be if the right back crossed into the box for the left back to score. So he wanted us to, find attacking fullbacks for him.
Yeah.
And then the next coach had a different philosophy. He liked, for example, his wingers to be really hard-working wide players. You're not going to have a wide player that doesn't track back. So he wanted a wide player that could fit into a different style of play. So both coaches would present to us, explaining exactly their philosophy, what type of players they're looking for. And then we use that to inform our reports, because there's no real point of suggesting a target man for a team that doesn't cross the ball, or suggesting a small striker for a direct team that needs a target man. So it was all style of play based. Yes, I went over. I had 3 meetings with them. 2 of them were with the same coach, because they had a coach who was there for 3 or 4 years. It was a really good experience to actually be in. Well, certainly out of your comfort zone, because you're meeting someone who's you see on TV and who's going to be questioning you and so forth. And that was really good. And then eventually I left that role in May last year in 2020. I think slightly because of COVID, but also just because they were sort of restructuring their department. And I think a few clubs have actually done that now. They've actually have a smaller staff that's are more tight, because they want to keep this information in a smaller pool. And so I left my role May 2020 after 6 years, which was obviously amazing experience.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, do you think South African coaches put a lot of emphasis in acquiring, transfers in that fashion, or do you think we tend to often look for free agents? We know some coaches that some clubs, they sign 9 or 10 players, not because they fit the system, but rather because of the price tag in the end of the day. And obviously, there's a lot of benefits to scouting a player properly, especially if you're doing it on such a great scale, and being involved in something like that and seeing both sides of the coin, must be quite cool for you, and also frustrating when you're working in South Africa.
Yeah, South Africa is a very strange market. It's more short term, so players might sign a 3-year contract but get released after a year, or even terminated after a few months. So there's less protection for players in their contracts, or at least a lot more clauses to break those contracts. So that's definitely one factor. And obviously that leads to older players being signed a lot more of the time, because you're not really caring if a player's got resale value. There's not really a market to sell players, except possibly to Sundowns and to Pirates. Maybe Chiefs, if they're willing to spend money in a future transfer window, would come into that. But very few clubs actually spend transfer fees. So it's difficult for a club, even like a club like SuperSport, to use this sort of method and then find players, because they would cost big fees from other clubs. So it's more of you can understand why free agents are signed a lot and more sort of smaller transfer fees. But there are some very strange deals in South Africa. You often will see a player who's been maybe a squad player at a relegated team or relegation threatened team move to one of the big three. And you can kind of predict they won't get many minutes there and they end up moving on pretty soon afterwards. So you do wonder if there's a lot of, some sort of unsavory dealings off the pitch. We know agents have quite a big say in transfers and a lot of clubs rely on the recommendations of agents. So it's not the most efficient way of doing things. And I think a PSL club that, had a sporting director and had more of a, better flows for their recruitment would probably have a lot more success. And it's not really healthy for a club like, Chip United or Baraka to sign 20 players every off-season and release another 20, because then obviously you have to build that team understanding again, that team chemistry. So with the turnover of coaches, it's hard too. Chipper will appoint Dan Malasela, and he has a very certain style of play. So he'll bring in 1 or 2 free agents that suit that. He'll maybe release a couple of new signings that were made just before he came in that he doesn't like. And then we know maybe he gets fired after 10 matches and another coach comes in. So yeah, it's not an efficient way of doing things.
Yeah.
But a lot of these clubs don't even have analysts for their first teams. So they're not going to have sort of head of recruitments or those sort of structures in place.
Yeah, it's quite baffling to think that you don't have an analyst in the modern game, but I don't necessarily like to compare, but just to give people a inside view of what teams are doing abroad. Some teams, I think you mentioned it just before the podcast or earlier in this podcast, that some teams will have 9 to 10 people working on just the analytical side of the game, where we in South Africa, I think sometimes the stigma is, and I probably was naive when I came into football myself, thinking, what does a video analyst do? You see the guy there in the terraces with the video camera, and you think, okay, great, he's just videoing the game and he passes on the DVD to the coach at the end of the game. But obviously, there's a lot more than that. What are some teams doing abroad that that we aren't, and what exactly does your work entail?
Yeah, I think overseas they see the value more. It's really as simple as that. I mean, of course, there's things like budgetary restraints in South Africa, but I think overseas they see the value and they understand that you need multiple analysts to fulfill the full role, because there's many facets. There's obviously analyzing your next opponents, so that's a huge one, because if you say, let's say Chelsea are playing Man City this weekend, they need to know exactly how City might play in this match. The coach might use that to inform his team selection. He might play different players than he would play in a different match. So you have to have someone doing that section of it, the opposition analysis. And that takes a long time, because you have to watch the last 5 or 6 matches. You might even go further back than that. You might watch your previous meetings against that team to see how they set up against you. And then you need someone to analyze your own team's performances. So if you've played on Wednesday nights against Porto as Chelsea, there'll be another analyst who will report back to the team on that match, what things went wrong, what things went well. They make some clips of some issues. There'll be a lot of data involved to have sort of, against their benchmarks. There'll be physical data, how much ground players covered, and especially at high intensity running. So that's a whole nother facet. And then there's the analysis side that's doing the things like just recording training and making clips of training sessions. There's like a big session that's based on recruitment, as certainly overseas. Video will be used to watch transfer targets, and they'll be watched in person. When there's a pandemic, coaches would fly out to watch games live, but you can be sure that video scouting was done to narrow the pool down, and using data as well. So you need a big team to really have base practice. And there's only a few teams in South Africa that actually have the budget, but also see the value in that. Because the thing is, of course, analysts aren't paid the most money you're going to have a pay. Analysts are generally quite low paid staff, and you could quite easily look at your playing squad and say, we don't need 6 wingers. The one guy might play 1 or 2 matches in a season. We can use that, 25,000 a month or whatever it might be, to get another analyst on board. And that might get you a few more points than that winger that just, plays 10, 15 minutes, 3 or 4 times a season. So I think it's changing kind of the way you look at it a bit, and you can get more value out of it.
Do you think, coaches like Rulani Mokoena, obviously Pitso before him, was quite big on analytics and analyzing opposition. But Rulani, especially in mainstream media, he seems to, really enjoy that side of the game and tries to break the mold. And, when you have a press conference of him, he actually goes quite in depth, with the opposition, and he breaks down their key players, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that helps the analyst in the end of the day, that coaches like that are stepping into the limelight and really exposing the importance of, guys like an analyst and in winning in the end of the day? I mean, because Sundowns are the most successful club in, the league at this point in time.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, when he tweets out that he's setting an opponent himself, I think it helps a lot because, Sundowns have 4 analysts in their club, or taking on different roles. And of course, they're the club with the most money, so they can afford to pay those salaries. But I think it's always important, even if you have 4 analysts, that a coach does some of it himself, because you can't really understand an opponent that's coming up unless you've watched those games yourself, because, it's maybe 8 to 10 minutes, the video that's played for the players on the opponents. But there's a lot of things in between that, how things come about. Even watching longer clips, if you're watching a counter attack, seeing how the other team was attacking and how they're building up, and maybe having men drawn out a bit, and then there's a space opening up when that ball's lost. All those things need to be watched more in more depth. And I think him highlighting it makes a massive difference. So, I mean, I would definitely encourage anyone to kind of watch his press conferences in full. They are available often on Twitter. But there's also, I mean, even not just Rulani Mokoena, but like Fadlu Davids at Pirates, their Twitter account, they put a halftime video every match where he speaks to the accountants, sort of to the camera, and gives some sort of first half analysis on what they need to improve. And I mean, it's kind of a hidden gem because no one really picks up on these. You don't see it retweeted a lot or commented on. You don't really see people putting those quotes out in media. But that's often the most interesting, one of the most interesting things you can see, because that's really like how coaches read the game from the sideline in the first half. And then you watch the second half and see, did they find the space, the way he said they should do? Did they push the defensive line high up because they were too deep, like he said?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that makes a huge difference to change the paradigm around analysis. But it's still got a long way to go. I mean, most clubs in the PSL do have analysts now, but they're usually by themselves, and, they don't have really the resources behind them to do everything they need to do.
Obviously, it's quite topical considering they're playing in the Nedbank Cup this week. And, unfortunately, the podcast will only be available the day after the game actually takes place. But, your team, you mentioned there, Fadlu Davids, obviously Joseph Zimbauer, Rulani Mokoena. What have you seen from them as coaches, and, how would you describe them as coaches, and what tactical approaches do they bring? I know Rulani, emphasizes a lot of, about position play and stuff like that. Obviously at Sundowns, it's quite easy because you've got the budget to buy the players you want. But what have you seen from Rulani Mokoena, and what type of coach is he? He's obviously still very young. I think he's only 33 years old. But what type of coach is he? And also on the other side, Joseph Zimbauer has now played, I think, coached 50 games for Pirates. He has got an incredible record. What has he brought to the table? And obviously helping them win the MTN8 has really won over a lot of fans.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with Pirates if you don't mind. But I mean, it's kind of cliche that German coaches, really like this high intensity football. And I think Pirates have tried to put intensity ahead of everything else in their play since he took over. So even in their recruitment and some of the players they let go, if they're players that can't play at this high tempo or who can't contribute to the team in all phases of the game, whether they, someone like Ndlovu Mamela, I mean, he is an amazingly talented player and by far Pirates' most creative player in recent years. And then, at the end of last season, he was let go and joined Amazulu. And he's sort of one of those players the rest of the team has to kind of balance out. You need to be a bit more defensive in other areas to give him that freedom to play. And I think Pirates are a team that's sort of very holistic. They want every player to be able to contribute in every phase. So they want everyone to be able to be involved in the build-up. They want everyone to be able to press. They want everyone to be able to play in transition, counter-press if they lose the ball. So, yeah, I mean, I just describe it as intensity über alles, basically, because that's kind of what they've gone for, especially with that Mamela departure. It sort of was the signaling of that. And I know that the way they train is very intense as well. But what I would say is this might not be necessarily the right season to do that. You've seen clubs like Liverpool hit a bit of a wall trying to play high intensity football this season because it's so different during a pandemic. It's not just the schedule's tighter. It's also just the general fatigue of us as humans to, of all the stuff that we're going through. It's hard to be able to play at an intensity like that all the time. You have players who've had COVID and they miss training. That affects your training. That affects how they come back. So it does feel like possession-based teams are doing a bit better. You see, obviously, our City are just kind of keeping the ball and resting with the ball and, sort of keeping some energy back and doing just the bare minimum in some games to win, not sort of winning 5-0 and 6-0 a lot, but getting to 2-0 and taking their foot off the gas. That seems to be the route to success this season. And I think that's kind of mirrored in the PSL. I thought Pirates could probably win the league this year, considering how they did when Zimbabwe first came in and he had that amazing run initially. But from the bio bubble, they had that really tough run where they couldn't score goals. They drew a lot of matches and they kind of fell out of the title race. And this season, I think it's been very disruptive for them. They had a lot of new signings. It's also very hard with the short preseason. They've had an enormous number of injuries. Obviously, they had all three frontline strikers out injured at one point, and they were playing Dion Hotter up front. So I think they've done quite well in that context, but I think there are still some doubts about how aesthetically pleasing it is. It's not necessarily always the most exciting football. And I think it probably would be if you had guys like Lorch and, Gabadini Mahango and so forth fit every week. So I'm keen to see how they do possibly next season. But I mean, we keep saying that about Pirates. Next season's their season, next season's their season. At some point, they do need to actually, take it all the way to the PSL title because they've been close. They've been 4 points, 6 points, etc. off Sundowns in recent years. Sundowns, they've done an amazing job this season. Obviously, to lose your head coach like they did with Pitso, and they've pretty much just gone on business as usual, winning games like crazy, 28 match unbeaten run. You have to be impressed by the work they're doing there. Obviously, they have the best players in the PSL and they have the best squad, which does help. They have a fantastic technical team. They've got 2 head coaches and then Steve Compella as the senior coach below that. I mean, there's basically 3 head coaches. They've got 4 analysts. Even with losing staff with Pitso Mosamani going with him to Achli, they've managed to replace them really well. So you have to be impressed, but I think a lot of it comes from that structure. If you lose the coach, but nothing much else changes in the club, you still have really good departments for analysis and for conditioning, for goalkeeper coaching and everything. It's not going to have a huge effect on you if you have good players.
Yeah.
As you said, they are more possession based. Whether their formation changes slightly between game to game, they play a diamond sometimes. Sometimes they play with 3 behind 1 striker. Sometimes they play with false 9. Less so this season with Peter Shalulile, but so it changes a little bit, but it doesn't really change a lot in the style. It's a back 4, usually a couple of holding players, and then a front 4 of sort of narrow interlinking players. I've said this a few times. I mean, Sundowns are not unpredictable sort of in their game plan. If you're assessing them before game, analysing them, you know exactly what they're going to do. It's just that you can't really stop them. They're just really good at what they do.
Yeah.
And they're inventive within that structure. They're with back heels and one-touch play and interplay. That's the unpredictability.
If we can just quickly touch on Peter Shalulile, obviously the talk of the town, and I think a lot of Bafana fans was hoping that he wasn't from Namibia. He's taken, like a duck to water at Mamelodi Sundowns. Obviously, a very hard worker. When I spoke to Simone Connolly on the podcast, she singled him out as being the hardest worker. Obviously they spent time together at Highlands Park. What has he brought to their game? Something different, and he seems to be scoring at will, and even at international level, he just can't stop scoring.
Yeah, he's an amazing player. I mean, he has missed a few chances. He could have even more goals this season, but he's really good in the air, but he's also really quick. And I mean, I'm just focusing on 2 sort of more physical attributes, but it's quite rare to have players that are quick and good in the air. And it's such a handful for teams to play against that when it's also a player that works so hard for the team, that can run channels, draw fouls, can bring teammates into play. He can play as a low number 9, but he used to play at the start of the season, sort of more of a split striker. So he was playing more towards the right-hand side with a diamond behind him, but still sometimes defending, tracking some left back, opposition left backs. He's just a team player, but also just an all-round handful. So he's perfect. He's a perfect player. And that also makes him perfect for the CAF competitions, because you play on, less good pitches and you're playing against more physical opponents, and you need to sometimes simplify your game. And he's a player that can run into the channels and, just get you by some time. Sort of in some ways like Jokelo Ranti did for Bafana when we were doing decently under Shakes Mashaba, like he would be good in those away qualifiers. And we don't really have someone like that now that can do that dirty work.
Yeah. I remember him scoring twice against Nigeria, I think in Nigeria itself. I'd love to go through every coach and, talk about their tactics, but obviously we don't have time for that. But maybe we could just quickly touch on a guy like Benni McCarthy. I think, AmaZulu, apart from Sundowns, the talk of the town as well with Benni and what he's brought to the club. That winning streak they've gone on. I know their owner came in and he said he wanted a top 4 finish, and it seems not too far off now, being second on the log. How impressed have you been by them? And obviously Benni being South Africa's, arguably, but probably South Africa's greatest ever player. How exciting is it to see him become, quite a good, astute coach so quickly in his, coaching career?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, obviously I followed him very closely from his days at Cape Town City, and I think his first season in coaching, he was, I think he almost tried to channel Mourinho a bit too much. Like some big games, he was quite defensive and tried to go with that style of play. And then I think in his second season, he sort of came into his own a lot more. His Cape Town City team were playing amazing football, probably the best football in the league that season, but also, leaking goals, but amazing to watch. Really clear style of play. I don't think that you could have foreseen him doing as well at AmaZulu as quickly as he has. I mean, they did have quite a good transfer window. They signed a lot of players from Pirates that weren't in the plans there. Of course, Mamela is an amazing player. And I mean, a player I wouldn't have got rid of if I was, in charge of Pirates. But he had a superb start to the season. They've recruited really well, but they also have a clear style of play. But they also have a good pragmatic element to them, because you have games like when you go play Chip away at Caesar Dukashi Stadium, like they did, and the pitch is bouncy and rubbish, and you can go and you can play your nice style of play, but you probably end up losing. And they sort of adjusted and they got a 1-0 win. So they've been grinding out some results and scoring late. And that's not always sustainable, but it's extremely, I think you can take a lot of optimism that they're doing this well, this early. Obviously, they need to have another good transfer window, but I don't see any reason why they can't actually finish second this season and play in the CAF Champions League next year, which would be unbelievable, really. And then challenge in coming seasons. So, I mean, I'm excited to see how Benni does, but he's another one that's been backed by the club. So they gave him his assistant coach that he wanted. He got to bring in his analyst to come, assist the analyst that's already there. He's got all the structure behind him that he wanted and asked for. And when you feel backed as well, it's not just that it helps your job day to day, but you feel different if you're backed by the club. You're more invested in it. And yeah, I think the club deserve a lot of credit for doing that as well, not just Benni. Yeah. But of course, he's doing an amazing job.
Yeah, obviously, anyone listening to this podcast would love to talk about Mandla Sakazi and, Arrows and Brandon Trutter, doing an amazing job in his first season in DSTV Premiership. And, Gavin Hunt, obviously talk about Kaizer Chiefs transfer ban, but maybe that opens the door for another podcast in the future. Grant, before I let you go, though, I would love to get your insight on your favorite players in the league. You spoke about Mamela there, and I don't know if it's your Ajax Cape Town influence and Ajax missing out on him. If I'm not mistaken, he was there at the start, wasn't he? And they just
he had a trial, I think, or he was on the books for a short period of time. Yeah.
Yeah. So I could pick up Mamela as one of your favorites, but who else in the league do you really enjoy watching? And if you're at a club and working at a club today, who would you like to sign, and who would be the first few players you'd be whispering in the head coach's ear?
It's a tough one. Might need a second to think about this. I'm guessing you might have to edit this section, actually. Let me think. Well, I think some players I'd like to highlight, actually, that have been really good this season, that maybe aren't favorites of mine, but the guys that I've enjoyed watching this season. One of them is Makaula at AmaZulu. He obviously joined from Highlands Park, and he's been, I would say, not far off being a player of the season contender. I mean, he wouldn't win it, but I think in a final 6, he could be in there. He's been amazing in midfield for AmaZulu, just breaking up play. And then Peter Shalolilo obviously would be another one. And then another ex-Highlands Park player is Mbata at TX Galaxy. I mean, he's been amazing as well, playing behind 2 strikers there, setting up a lot of chances, scoring goals, assisting goals. He was a massive part of Ndlovu turning around bottom place when he took over to moving into sort of a top 8 challenge. So they would probably be 3 that I'd pick. In terms of recruitment, there's some players I think that it's really time for them to go to big clubs, guys like Tarek Fili's and stuff. I think actually he should have probably gone even a year or 2 ago. I think he could play for any of the big 3 clubs without any trouble.
Another former Ajax player that they missed out on.
Yeah. He's a weird one, but I mean, it's the thing about him at Cape Town City, like he defends in such an exposed system. They don't park the bus, they don't have a lot of bodies around him to support him. So he's often sort of defending big spaces, and he's got a lot of sort of high risk, high stakes defending, and he does it so well. So he's a player I'd definitely like to see in the Bafana setup as well. That would definitely be one. And I mean, other players are like, I think one that's probably doesn't get enough credit and that's actually not playing much at the moment is Ricardo Nascimento. He's one of my favorites. He's definitely, I'd say, definitely the best defender in the Premier League, in the PSL at Premier Soccer League at building up from the back. If you're playing against Sundowns and you're expecting him to start, you almost have to tailor your whole pressing and your game plan around stopping him from building up, which I think shows his quality a lot. I think some other guys are like the more multifunctional ones that can play a few positions. Guys like Mabue and Ndlovu, Makaringa, those guys who played at Maritzburg together and just play at like breakneck speed. I really like those 3 players. So that's probably my list.
Cool, that's great. You talk about Nascimento there, and obviously left-footed centre-backs seem to be. I know Pep Guardiola has brought in a few left-footed centre-backs in his time at Manchester City. How different are they, and how important are they to the modern coach? It seems like left-footed players are really sought after. From a tactical point of view, how sought after are they for head coaches and for clubs, and how different do they make the game, especially from build-up play and just opening angles for the players in front of them?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. It's so important because, if you have a right-footed left centre-back, they're not usually particularly comfortable on their left foot. They are usually more comfortable on their left foot than left footers are on their right. But it often means you can kind of squeeze them against that touchline and press that way. Even the angle of their passing means sometimes the way the pass curls can sort of go behind teammates instead of being in their path for them to sort of carry the first touch forward. It's massively important, and you can understand clubs recruit from that perspective, especially overseas. Guardiola signed Laporte, but then he signed Nathan Ake because he needed a backup left-footed centre-back.
Yeah.
Obviously, weirdly, neither play most weeks. But they've changed style of play slightly, fair enough. But you see at Sundowns with Nascimento and Lebusa, it's massively important for teams that play out from the back. And obviously, there's always a shortage of them. I mean, you'd think that you'd see a lot more left-footed centre-backs going for like massive transfer fees and so forth in world football, but you don't really see that because just so few of them that are actually that good. Yeah, it's important. And I mean, Sundowns are one of the few clubs that you'll find that have played two left-footed centre-backs in this, together in a back 4. Nascimento actually played right centre-back a lot last season and the season before because Lebusa was playing with him to the left. And I mean, even at right centre-back, he was amazing at building up. Like the angles aren't quite right for him and looks a bit awkward sometimes, but he can still find passes to his players between the lines, which I think kind of highlights his quality even more.
Yeah, most definitely. Grant, thanks for your insight. Thanks for your time. I won't keep you much further. I think there's a Chiefs game coming up against Baroka, is it? And then the big Nedbank Cup quarterfinal. Excited for the weekend's, football as well. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your insight. I really appreciate it. And hopefully there's another podcast in the near future.
Awesome. Thanks, AB.
Ciao. Thank you for listening to Disky Discussions. If you have any questions or guests you'd like me to have on the show, please hit me up at AB_Vasson on Twitter or on Instagram. Stay safe, like, subscribe, aware.